Alrighty, so we're back at it, still trimming on this bowl. I'm really paying attention to how the side of the bowl interacts with the foot, and I'm going to go ahead and just level out the top one more time and create that final ring for my foot. And like I said, I'm looking for that 1/4 inch width. We don't want to go too much wider than that, as it's gonna sort of not be as attractive. What I'm doing here is I'm cutting a little ridge where the foot and the center of the pot meet. That's gonna help me level out the middle and allow for me to create a nice even barrier. If I do that, I have a good width for how deep I need to go, because it's really easy to go through the middle of this pot, like trim all the way through and make a big hole. And the best way to sort of check is to just tap it lightly with your finger. If it starts to bow in or dent, then it's too thin. You can if you can move it at all, really, it's gonna be too thin and you need to stop trimming at that point. Like, don't go any farther. Now I'm checking if it's level, if my wooden knife sits nice and level, and I'm going to go ahead and clean up the cut marks with my wooden knife, and I'm just compressing the edge here. Make sure your tools are always clean, because if you've got a lot of that excess clay just hanging out on your blade, it's going to get harder and harder to make a cut, or at least a clean cut, and you might even like knock your pot off. So remove those lugs when you're happy, and make sure to grab your pot from the center, not the foot and not the top, because those are going to be your weakest points. They will be more likely to crack at those points. Notice I have a little dent in here. It's not that bad, it's not that noticeable, but it's unfortunately not something I'm going to be able to fix, because at this stage of dryness, it's just too dry for me to try to push it back. And if I were to try to push it back, what would happen is my bowl would crack. So clean off your wheel. And we're going to do a wide bowl. For this one, I'm going to do an inset foot. I think it works with the shape here. Now, something to note for this particular piece is this bowl is a lot wetter than my other bowls. So this is a good example of what it's going to look like to trim a wet bowl. So center your bowl to trim. You use your finger guns and just push ever so slightly. Alright, just like with every other bowl we've thrown, first things first is we're going to take off any extra material that does not help us. Just clean up that silhouette a little bit, clean up the edges, level out the top, so that way when we go in to trim our foot, that excess material is not going to mess up the even quality we're looking for. So for an inset foot, we're not going to make an external shape. We're going to just bring the edge of the bowl all the way to the edge of where the foot will lie. And instead of cutting into the side, we're going to cut just right into the middle. Now, level out your bowl and then pull it to the thickness that you want your foot to be. Notice how I'm having to sort of clean off my tool more and more, and that's because this clay is wet. This clay is still pretty wet, and honestly I should have probably waited a little longer, but I want to make sure I get it before it gets too dry. So if your clay is a little bit wetter, it's going to be a lot easier to trim through the bottom, so you need to be very conscious of how thick you go and making sure you clean your tool, because those little gummy bits are going to mess you up real fast. So because my clay is so wet, I'm actually going to do a lot of the shaping with my wooden knife. I'm just using the edge the same way I would use my trim tool, and I'm just creating that nice bevel. With the inset feet, you really want to make sure that that center part is not raised, because it'll try to sit on the middle part versus sitting on the outside part. Double check, make sure it's level. And I'm just trying to create a nice sort of like visual division. So because this bowl is so wet, I don't think I can get it any better than this. But this is essentially what an inset foot would look like. Your edge would go all the way to the top, and you would just have that trimming underneath on the bottom. And with super wet clay, it's very important to flip it over and just double check that it's not rounded on the center, because when you go to trim the middle of the pot, sometimes you will trim in a way that pushes at the clay, and then you'll have a little mountain, a little bump on the inside of your bowl, and that's not fun. That's not attractive. So I'm going to go grab our cups. I've trimmed all the bowls that I have. We're going to trim cups now, and it's important to note that when things get taller, the trimming gets harder, and that's just because of physics. So bowls have a wider center of gravity, and because your cup is a little bit narrower at the top, trimming something like this is going to be significantly harder. Not so hard that it's impossible, but you've got to be more conscious of wetness and the level of things, because if you push too hard, it's just going to fly all around your wheel, and it's not going to be a good time. So just like before, center your pot using your finger guns and lug it down. With cups, you've got to be very conscious of the shape that you've made and how that corresponds to your feet, because where bowls are pretty like one way, cups can be all sorts of different shapes. It's a lot easier to make a cup kind of funky than it is to make a bowl. So with this particular cup, I'm thinking I'm going to do a variation of the teacup foot. And just like every other time, I'm just going to go and level out that top, so that way I don't have any cut marks from where I wired it off my bat. So I've decided, like I said, it's a variation of the teacup foot. It's going to be a little more up and down, but it's going to be still pretty rounded. And I'm going to try to have it correspond to the shape of the cup itself. So I'm going to just reinforce, it's very important with trimming that you do things very gradually. We don't want to try to go fast. If you try to go fast, the likelihood that you're going to knock your pot and make it do the dance of shame, which is where it flies off the wheel and hits all the sides of the splash pan and just gets damaged to all heck, is very likely. If you try to go fast, that's what's going to happen. However, when you trim, you sort of want to go a little fast with your pedal. But be conscious, especially with tall things, when you go too fast, the likelihood that it's going to fly off is going to be a lot higher. Cool, I think that looks pretty good. I'm just double checking and I'm running my finger along the edge to make sure I haven't made it too thin. And I think I've decided there's a little bit of like a deviation I want to make, or I need to clean up something. But other than that, I think it looks pretty good. So just like every other time, go ahead and take your lugs off. Now as you trim, those are going to get dry pretty quickly. So just be conscious of that. We don't want to use super dry clay to try to lug down our pots, because it's not going to stick. The opposite of that is if your clay is too wet, it's going to stick to the sides of your pot, and then you'll get these ugly sort of boogers is the only word I can really think to use right now. Once again, I've dented another pot. I dented this when I picked it up, so you know, it is what it is. So it's very important that I respond to the shape of this. This one's got a pretty dramatic bottom versus the top, and it's pretty rounded there. So I'd want to make sure that my foot complements that. And so I think I'm going to keep it fairly flat. And the important thing when we're working flat is that we make sure that the inner ring, the very center, does not extend higher than the outside. That's something that happens with flatware. Basically, you've got a higher point here in the center, which will keep it from sitting level on the table. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to divot that just ever so slightly, just so that way I know it's going to sit level on that outside ring versus trying to sit on the center. That looks pretty good, and I forgot to take off this other lug, so notice that's stuck with it. I'm just going back and checking my rim, make sure it's as even as I can possibly get it. I'm just going to set that aside. Remember to have pulled your handles before you threw your pot. That way, when you're done trimming it, you can probably just go ahead and attach your handle. So pull your handles first before you trim your piece. That way your handles will be dry enough to sort of attach. If your handles aren't dry enough, make sure to hit your cups or whatever with a little bit of moisture and wrap them, because you don't want them getting any drier, because when you want to go and attach handles, it's important to have it the same moisture level.